Hello and welcome to today's video. It's been a while since I've had a video where I could sit down and have a proper chat with you guys, but since Helldivers 2 has sort of taken center stage here on the channel, I thought I'd try something I've never really attempted before, and that is a build guide. Now these can be helpful insight to new players of various games, to give them kind of a baseline play style that they can utilise, and perhaps modify over time to better play to their strengths. I benefited from build guides back in the days of Team Fortress 2, and it helped me find my own play style for the Pyro class, which was my main back in the day. But I think you guys probably get the picture by now. I don't need to run through what a build guide is, otherwise why are you watching this? So we'll get into today's subject. Now, I've been a pretty devout player of the game, only really taking substantial breaks during time away, and during the recent PSN controversy, where I left the game unplayed until the PSN link requirement for Steam players was lifted. But I'm sure that incident is still somewhat fresh in everyone's mind, so I'm not going to harp on about that here. The point is that I play this game quite a lot, and I don't claim to be great at it, like at all, far from it. This build in question is designed around the Automaton faction, and it's built mainly for medium level difficulties, as that's my personal comfort zone for solo missions. I recently tried Suicide Mission for the first time, and I fared better than I expected, but it is admittedly largely up to your teammates, so right away I would label this build as more of an aggressive support build, if you plan on taking it into more difficult missions. It should do you just fine in medium missions, but it does have a few glaring weaknesses that I will be going over as we proceed today. So, the build in question is one I've taken to calling the Grenadier. This is because it is largely built around the grenade launcher support weapon. This weapon is best utilised for attacking enemy structures as well as groups of light and medium enemies. In particular, it's a fantastic tool for destroying light fabricators, and serves as a quick way to dispatch medium enemies such as Scout Striders and the various types of Devastators. It also does well against large groups of troopers, and in cases where you don't quite get all of them, you can quickly switch to your primary to take out the survivors. The exact primary you use isn't of too great importance, but I would recommend something with medium armor penetration as a minimum. My weapon of choice is the SG-225 Breaker Shotgun for this reason. It can quickly dispatch troopers, and it's also fairly effective against Devastators. But I would more so recommend you attack the default Devastators with this weapon, or even the rocket variant if you can get close enough and are confident in your ability to evade their rockets. For heavy Devastators, and to an extent even the Scout Striders, I would recommend the grenade launcher more so. The explosive damage is enough to bypass both enemy shields, and it's a more surefire way to take one down if you're on your own and they're facing towards you. Striders usually take 1, and heavy Devastators typically go down in 3. However, the damage can be a bit inconsistent, so sometimes it can take up to 3 to bring a Strider down, but that is usually down to luck. Since the grenade launcher is the centerpiece of this build, you're going to need to make sure you can keep it well supplied, which is why the second part of this build is the supply backpack. For those unfamiliar, it is a resupply pod that you can wear on your back. Simply hit down on the D-pad. I don't know the button for PC players, so sorry for you guys, and it will resupply you with the same amount as a normal resupply pod would. You can even top up the 4 cubes you carry with you using a normal resupply pod. In fact, using one of their blocks will not only top up all your ammos, grenades and stims as normal, but it also gives you an extra cube for your backpack. So you're essentially getting 2 resupplies, one of which can be used later. This inclusion of the supply backpack lends this build even more to a support class, as you can also resupply your teammates at the push of a button. It can be good to do this on occasion if you find you're making your own ammo last longer than normal, or if you keep finding ammo packs on the ground during your given mission. Now this combination is of course not perfect. You are going to struggle against most heavy enemies. Hulks can only really be damaged in their back vents using this loadout, which of course is going to be difficult on your own. I typically run the G123 thermite grenades for this reason, as if you're out of options, you can stick a couple on a Hulk or even a tank, and it'll do some decent damage. I've not tested this super thoroughly, but I have been able to take both down with only the thermite grenades, so be sure to take those with you. You can also use the stun grenades to briefly immobilize them, so you can quickly jog around to their weak spot and fire away, but I myself have never used the stun grenades, so I can't really comment on their effectiveness in this loadout. Weirdly, I find tanks slightly easier to deal with than Hulks, as they're much slower moving, and I find myself having an easier time getting around to the weak points of a tank, and by extension a cannon tower, than I do a Hulk. Now if none of that works for you, or if there's simply too much going on, then that is where we use our third stratagem, the orbital laser. This will absolutely melt through Hulks, tanks, cannon towers, and everything else in their path. They will automatically target the heaviest enemy in the area, and so are much more precise and less dangerous to your teammates than some of the other orbitals would be. However, exactly like the other orbitals, they have a very long cooldown, 5 whole minutes between each one, and you're limited to only 3 lasers in a mission. It's for this reason I'd highly recommend saving it for use against heavy outposts to take out cannon towers and potentially any Hulks or tanks nearby, along with multiple other buildings if it's got the time. But if you're struggling against a Hulk or tank on its own, then there's not really much shame in using a laser in a pinch. I'd recommend more so trying to avoid these enemies or potentially lure them into a more crowded area, so the laser can take care of them too after it's done with the heavy enemies. Now originally, a laser was capable of one-shotting a factory Strider, provided it used its entire duration on the Strider alone. However, these walkers have since been buffed and now have slightly too much health to do that, and sadly the rest of this build is largely useless against them. So I'd recommend you only tackle Striders if you've got a friend, or are somehow able to lower it to a faulty Hell Bomb, or if you're confident you can stall for time long enough for the 5 minutes needed to get off a second laser. Now heavy enemies like these are definitely a struggle for this build, and usually bank on you having the laser ready. So if you find yourself coming across these enemies too regularly, you might be better off with the autocannon. However, this disables your ability to use the supply backpack, and it requires you to stand still while reloading, which the grenade launcher doesn't. So it'd be quite a different build, and I'd recommend seeking out a dedicated autocannon guide so you can better choose your stratagems around it. As for the fourth stratagem of this build, I typically run a Gatling Sentry. This can be used for 3 purposes within the build. To help you mow down a large amount of light to medium enemies, as you'd expect, to defend an area while you engage with an objective like a terminal, or to distract enemies. I often deploy a sentry when attacking a medium outpost, or even a light one if I've got it handy, since it only takes 180 seconds to replenish, so the enemies can focus on the sentry while I attack the fabricators. It's especially useful when playing alone, but it's still pretty handy for missions with teammates. Now as far as secondary weapons and armor sets are concerned, this is more up to you as it doesn't play too great a role in the larger build, but I'll quickly run through what I use. I typically use the P19 Redeemer pistol as a last resort weapon, as it can be handy against melee units if they're closing in on you, and you don't have time to reload your primary weapon. It does quite well against a single berserker, for instance, and it can take out roughly 4 troopers if your aim is good enough. For armor, you'd ideally want a set that has the Fortified perk, as it protects you against explosive damage, and that's kind of the central theme here in case you somehow hadn't worked that out. The original version of this build utilised the B24 Enforcer obtained through the Superstore, as a medium armor set for more balanced stats and manoeuvrability. Nowadays, I opt more into the CW22 Kodiak, obtained through the Polar Patriots War Bond, for a heavy armor set that prioritises protection and health. If you've maxed out the default War Bond and have access to the DP11 Champion of the People set, that's another very strong choice due to its Democracy Protects ability that lessens the chance of dying from fatal damage and prevents bleed damage. Now the real reason these are my 3 go-tos is obvious, because I'm the type of guy who owns a real set of Imperial Stormtrooper armor, so of course I'm going to try and Star Warsify my character in the game, either as a First Order Snowtrooper, a Phase 3 Dark Trooper, or even a Mandalorian. Let's not kid ourselves here. Now some of you might have noticed that I've neglected to mention gunships in this guide, and the reason for that is simple. This build is useless against them. Even the orbital laser seems to not target gunships for whatever reason, which is why I can't stress enough that this build is intended to work alongside other players with different builds, or in the medium difficulties where gunships don't even show up. Which is why I take to classifying it as an aggressive support build. It's used to deal with masses of light and medium enemies, attacking outposts, and supporting your teammates who are better equipped to fight the heavy enemies. You deal with those threats to allow them to focus the heavies. And because heavies are relatively rare on medium difficulties, you should be largely okay on your own in those missions. Just time your attacks on larger bases and try to evade hulks where possible until your orbital laser is at the ready to take them out for you. Do all that and you'll go quite far. And that's about it really. That is the Grenadier aggressive support build for the automaton missions in Helldivers 2. I hope this was useful to players struggling to find a play style, and feel free to modify it to better suit how you play. In fact, feel free to leave any suggestions in the comments on how to alter it for other people, as it does admittedly have many glaring weaknesses, as we've discussed. I would be prepared to make a similar video for a Terminid focused loadout, but I only really play bug missions for major or personal orders, as I much prefer fighting the automatons. I feel it's more thrilling, there's more strategy involved, like prioritising certain targets like detector towers and stratagem jammers, and it generally feels much more fulfilling than the Terminids, which generally boils down to shoot everything that moves and don't get puked on. A quick version of my Terminid build for those interested is to simply swap the grenade launcher for either the standard machine gun or the flamethrower, and sometimes to swap the orbital laser for the Patriot exosuit, if other teammates have their own orbitals on hand. Also, bring the default frag grenades for bug holes, and if you're going after bug holes specifically, the grenade pistol might be worth including as well. That concludes this video, but I'm sure there will be plenty more Helldivers 2 content to come, whether it be raw gameplay footage as usual, or the occasional edit if I have a noteworthy mission. Thank you all for watching. Now go and do your part for democracy, for liberty, and for Super Earth.